Hello and welcome back to our series of lectures on the chapters covering humanism in the 21st century. Today we're turning to chapter 8, dealing with the concept of culture. Here, culture is not exactly the same word with which we began this class when we were talking about the philosophical underpinnings that we use to describe the world around us. Rather, here, culture is something of a stand-in within the American framework for what normally is talked about as class, which is one of the four large sociological categories of identity that tend to shape the majority of the ways that we experience our own concept of subjectivity in our life. So with that caveat, let's move ahead. At this point, we've established quite a few tools for talking about gender, sexuality, and race. We've talked about it in historical terms. We've also looked at the way that structures of power shape the frameworks of identity in terms of what are known as hierarchical binaries. A hierarchical binary is, you'll recall from our previous chapter, the formation of a binary division that helps to stabilize meanings. So, for example, male is contrasted to female, black is contrasted to white, gay is contrasted to straight, and so on. Within these frameworks of binary, you also have a hierarchical structure in which one of those positions is consistently privileged. And this matters especially not only because that creates inequality in that specific binary, but also because those binaries reach deep into other attributes of our culture. Again, think about the way that someone's gender identification shapes so many things, right? The kind of job or career they may have, the money they may make, the kind of physical safety they may or may not feel in different conditions, the clothing that they wear, the friends and the conversations with their friends that they have, and so on, and so on, and so on. All of these things are, at least to some degree, and often very strongly shaped by those structural binaries of identity. So when we talk about a hierarchical formation, we're talking about not only the specific way in which a subject position, such as straight over gay, might be privileged in our culture and normalized in contrast to another way of being a person. In this case, it also reaches into almost every other attribute, including the very small details of how we live our lives. With that said, we can start to think about this in terms of the concept of culture and the privileges that the concept of high culture tends to have. Now, this is a really interesting and reflexive moment within a university class because, in fact, there are a number of culturally built assumptions about subjectivity in a college level class. We tend to privilege notions of what is called high culture, as opposed to something that's thought of more as low culture. And you can hear the hierarchy already there within the framing of the concept of culture. High culture tends to be things that are academic or intellectual and historically rigorous. Think about the difference, for example, between going to see an action movie and going to see a foreign film with subtitles that deals with abstract topics. One of those will be very popular and very accessible, and the other one will require some interest in other cultures, other places, probably some educational background, etc. So if I'm at a movie theater and I'm seeing one group stream into the action film and I'm seeing another group stream into the foreign film, I already have a good idea of a lot of the other values and assumptions attendant in the subjectivity of the people who are going to be watching those different movies. Just like gender, therefore sexuality and race, culture is one of the primary indications not only of the large-scale distinctions that we make between high and low culture, but it also reaches down into many other elements. So I thought it was appropriate that we become self-conscious of this fact as we turn to what is probably the most famous museum in the world, the Louvre Museum in Paris. We already mentioned this. This is the museum that houses the Mona Lisa along with many other masterpieces, famous pieces of art. This is what it looks like from an aerial view. If we go to a ground view in the main entrance, which was recently redesigned in the 1990s, we see a beautiful glass pyramidal structure, and you enter that, and instead of going directly into the buildings that you see here as the Louvre, you actually go all the way down into the underground, 3 floors, in fact, below the surface of the road. But people don't tend to stay there, right? That's the place where you start, and then you take escalators up into the main building. The main building used to be the royal palace in Paris of the monarch of France. We already met one of those monarchs, Louis XIV, and indeed he would have spent some time in this lavish palace. You can see from this image that it's beautifully decorated, and there are images, paintings, murals, statues, gilded surfaces, designs, incredible furniture on every single part of this original palace. And in that most beautiful of the areas, we also see artworks that are considered Western and, in that sense, officially art. Right? And if you look around, you'll see lots of beautiful pieces. I'm not arguing that the art in the Louvre is not beautiful, but I want to point something else out also, which is that if you go down into that basement area, if you go down into the lower sections underground, not this beautiful original palace, but something that's much starker and simpler and much more of a modern museum kind of a feel, also without all of this beautiful natural light, you move away from this world of art and into a set of artifacts. Now, what is an artifact? An artifact is something that's taken from another culture and is seen as perhaps beautiful or interesting, but we believe was not originally intended with the same purpose as art, the cultural purpose of art. We'll talk about that concept of art a little bit later, but for now we can think of an artifact as something like this. This would be a Fang mask. This is from the Fang people in Western Africa, and we don't know very much about the mask, but it's there available to be viewed, and when we see it, we notice that this looks importantly different than the paintings hanging in the main gallery of the Louvre. So our starting question is, why? Why are some things called art and other things called artifact? Why are some of them immediately aesthetic? In other words, things that we could study as a beautiful piece of intentional art, and others are considered artifacts, perhaps without that intention or without that sophistication that we think we have in our traditional Western concepts of art. So let's contrast a piece of art that would be hanging in the Louvre with this artifact, the Fang mask, on the right. The piece that I've chosen here is a remarkable painting by Jacques-Louis David, and it was one of the most famous paintings of the 18th century, 1700s, at a time when the French Academy, the style of French painting, was changing to what is known as sometimes realism or sometimes neorealism. And this piece, The Oath of the Horatii, is immediately interesting from a Western artistic perspective. Look at the drama and the tension, right? You have the figures on the left, the 3 Horatii brothers who are swearing an oath to fight for what will become Rome against 3 other brothers, the Koratii brothers, who live in another town and who are at war with this region, again, that's going to become Rome. And then contrast that image here to the women that we have just behind the father figure, right? Those women are passive and soft, right, in a contrastive way. We see gender at play in this construction, but these are Western notions of gender. And the lines that divide these two spaces are quite stark, aren't they? Right? You have a very geometric structure in the floor pattern, and behind that you have Romanesque arches, very simple, stark structures. These were supposed to remind people of the virtue of sacrifice for one's country. And this was actually a new idea. It's important to us today, and Jacques-Louis David was a big fan of the concept of democracy. And he, in fact, was part of the French Revolution, which happened just a little while after the American Revolution, both revolutions looking to establish modern concepts of democracy. So, right off the bat, one of the things that we see with the Oath of the Horatii is that there's a lot to say. There's a story, there is the interpretation of the artistic palette, there is the biography of the painter, there are cultural concepts that are interwoven, such as the gender division that we have going on here, etc., etc., etc. In other words, if you got an academic in front of this painting, they could talk about it for a long time. And I think that there is a lot to say. It's worth talking about. But if we look over here at the Fang mask by contrast, remarkably, we see that the differences in that Fang mask from our notions of Western cultural art actually mean that we can't say very much about it. Perhaps we can talk about it in anthropological terms, so we can talk about the culture and the space of the Fang people, what we know of them, but at no point will it become an intersubjective conversation in which we're mutually talking about something that is considered art. What I mean by that is that we know that Jacques-Louis David meant to be creating art, and he was creating it to reach down through the ages to communicate something. Whereas we don't know those things about the Fang mask. We don't know who made it. We don't know why they made it. We can't ask them, talk to them, and then use that as a way of getting into those concepts of cultural difference. So what is the difference between art and artifact? In many ways, it has to do with our assumptions about culture, doesn't it? Right? What we think of as normative culture and high culture, and then what tends to be dismissed from that realm of high culture, and therefore considered something less. And it is certainly true that in our cultural viewpoint, an artifact is less significant than a grand piece of art. This has to do with our perspective, right? How we're looking at things, how we are imagining those things. If you watch the video that I have here on the Oath of the Horatii, you see that there's a tremendous amount to be said. But why is it that our orientation keeps us from really saying useful and interesting things about that Fang mask, which is probably very important and interesting when understood from the right perspective? To illustrate this problem of perspective, I have presented here a world map, but one that from our notion of normative perspective is actually upside down. That's already a strange thing to be able to say, because the Earth is a ball floating in space. That means there is no specific up or down, but we do like to have a certain orientation when we look at the map, and we treat that orientation as normal. So go ahead and take a second here as I'm speaking to look at this upside down map and look at what feels foreign or strange simply by shifting our perspective. Look at how easily we can get confused and thrown from this notion of orientation. If you try to locate some of these countries, do they look the same as you imagine them already? Is it hard to find those things? Just like with the Fang mask, when you feel disoriented, it's really important to notice how you respond emotionally and intellectually. Does it seem interesting, or does it seem frustrating? Is it something that you want to dig into, or is it something that you want to avoid, this feeling of disorientation, right? These are very useful problems because the very concept of orientation is one that we're going to have to dig into, right? The word orientation originally comes from the Latin word oriens, which has to do with the sunrise. Orient from a Western European perspective, as in the Roman Empire, in which we get the word, from which we get the word oriens, would have seen the East immediately to the east of Western Europe as the Orient, the Oriental place, and those are words that we may know, although Oriental for us now has become a racist term, and we'll talk about why it is that designating a certain area within a certain perspectival set of assumptions actually feeds into our previous conversation about the problems of stereotypes or racism. The way that orientation functions is to situate one person within a normative perspective and then see the things outside of that as abnormal. In other words, we're dealing with one of those psychological phenomena of abjection. So when we think about the Orient as somehow the East, the place from which the sun rises, we realize immediately that that's actually a relative perspective. For example, if I say, from which position does the sun rise for the United States? Well, actually for us, the East is Western Europe, right? So the word West there, or East, is rather confusing. Just like when we say the Middle East, what we really specifically mean is a geographical area, not a place that is somehow in an absolute East or Oriental position. So think about the way that the Japanese, for example, see what is to the east, right? Where would the sun be rising for the Japanese? And if, again, this is disorienting, notice how it makes you feel to have to grapple with these questions. Well, the east for Japan is actually the United States, isn't it? Okay, so what are we doing as we go around the globe? We realize that there's no such thing as east or west, right? These are cultural constructs, and they have a big impact on how we imagine ourselves in relation to other people. So the fact that we can say that there is an Oriens, a place from which the sun rises, always imaginatively situates us back in Western Europe, as though that's the center of the world and the center of our normative thought. And when we talk about high culture and low culture, one of the first things that we can start to understand is that high culture always makes the assumption that there is a normative perspective from which to see the world, a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, therefore. And that is embedded in a binary such as the one you encounter in high cultural classes at university, such as a class in the humanities, which makes certain assumptions about how you should think and about how you should see the world and which objects we are going to be talking about, such as the Mona Lisa, or the Oath of the Horatii, in order to make those points. So part of the reason that this matters so much, right? The way that we situate things as, for example, East or West, or orient ourselves within cultural frameworks of what is considered normal or outside of those norms, is that language and culture are inextricably bound up and powerfully interrelated. I want to give you an example of how powerful the concepts of language and culture are when we start to think about something not just like space, as we just did with the upside down map and the notion of orientation, but also something as fundamental as time. Take, for example, the concept of calendrical time, right? What is the calendar? It's our way of marking out the time of the year, and we also do that through a system of marking out days, and then from days into hours and minutes and seconds and so on. So we have a highly demarcated concept of time that we're working with. The way that we situate that within language actually ends up shaping a lot of our assumptions. For example, the notion that a month should be about 30 days. The feeling of what an hour is or should be, right? But what's fascinating is our inherited notion of time, the way that the years go by and what a normal number of years are for us for various things, the concept of how that time is organized around, say, things like holidays or other cultural events. You might be surprised to know that this powerful cultural description of time is actually hybrid. It's something that is a mixture of different influences. Our original calendar comes more or less from the Roman culture that I was just mentioning, that also gives us the notion of the East and the West. That idea is partly due to the pagan Roman culture that we know of. So, for example, the word January comes from the pagan god Janus, who had two faces, one facing, in this case, forwards to the new year, and one facing backwards to the old year. It's quite a poetic image. But it's also important to realize that Rome had several historical events that changed its own culture radically. For example, there used to be 10 months in the calendar, and indeed that would have been our inheritance too, right up until the present day, most likely. In fact, the last few months of the year for us still bear the numerical system for the Latins of the 10-month system. That would be October, which means the 8th. November, which means the 9th, and December, which means the 10th. And if you have any Latin roots, if you speak Spanish, then you probably recognize those word roots also in those names. But during the imperial period of Roman culture, Augustus, who became Caesar Augustus, the dictator of Rome, who overthrew the democratic republic, also changed the calendar in a calendrical reform in which he very modestly put himself as one of the new months. I guess you can probably guess which one that is, and his adopted father, Julius Caesar, who then became July. Right, so we added July and August to make it a 12-month calendar, and those cultural events that happened long, long ago, more than 2,000 years ago, actually ended up shaping our calendar to this day, so that we have a 12-month system that feels normal. Where did we get the 7-day week, though? That actually is an inheritance of the Hebrew scripture, right? From the Torah and the belief systems from monotheism that we get that spells out the concept of the 7-day week and the Sabbath. The Sabbath originally was what we think of now as Saturday, so there have been a few changes over time, but fundamentally we have the concept of a 7-day week with one day designated specifically for rest, and we inherit that from a very non-Roman imperial tradition, the Jewish monotheistic tradition in the Palestinian area, right? The area of the Eastern Mediterranean. This is even stranger if we start to think about where we get the days of the week names, right? So the names for the days of the week, for some strange reason, and this has to do with our English inheritance a little bit, which comes partly from the Norse cultures, the Vikings who settled England and then established some of the word roots that we still use in English. And so, for example, our Wednesday comes from the god Woden or Odin, right? So Wodenstag would have been the original name for that. And of course, Thursday, right? Thorstag would have been named after the figure Thor, who you may know from the Marvel movies. Another god, Freya, was the namesake for Friday, right? Then, strangely, again, we shift back. Our word Saturday actually is given to Saturn, which is one of the Roman pagan gods. So we're all over the map with this. And then Sunday and Monday are actually just Sonntag and Montag. Again, more pagan references, but simply days referencing the sun and the moon, so more of a natural paganism rather than a set of deities, right? Even more strangely, our concept of the 24-hour day was first mapped out by the Egyptians. They loved the number 24, by the way. It shows up all over the place. But the concept of a 24-hour day for us is an arbitrary way of designating those hours, right? We can have as many hours or minutes, etc. as we want. We would just need to designate different quantities of time over that. Now, what's the point of all of this? The relationship between language and culture, I'm arguing, is not one in which we have a strict hold on the meanings that we inherit from this language or these linguisto-cultural constructs. Instead, what we have is a system of hybridity in which we mix up many cultural elements and inherit many of those. So we've taken a lot from the Roman Empire, we've taken a lot from the Greek culture, which we'll be mentioning again in just a moment, but you see also Hebraic culture, Egyptian culture, Norse culture, and so on and so on. These mixtures and intermixings of cultures are only mixings if we think of those cultures as separate and pure from the beginning. And now what I want to actually do in this lecture is start some of the work of breaking down those Platonic fantasies of separation. The notion that these cultures are somehow individuated actually does us a disservice from an historical point of view, because it doesn't give us a full image of the complexity of cultural interaction. So even though language is arbitrary and our language history is hybrid, it's still a powerful form of identity. It shapes us. And I want to give you an example that comes not from Roman culture this time, but from the Greeks. The term is barbarian. And that's a term, of course, that you know. We don't use it as much today as it was used in the past. It used to be a very serious and important word. That's because it was actually invented during a specific set of wars when the Persian Empire, the the vast empire in what we now call the Middle East, gathered together a huge army and attacked Greece. Greece, up until this point, which was actually known as Hellas, by the way, the term Greece was given to them by their Roman conquerors. So Hellas was composed of a series of city-states, or polis. These polis are very different than what we think of as a nation or a country or even a city within those spaces. They were a city-state in the sense that they were both cities or urban aggregates, but also independent from one another. And in fact, they oftentimes were at war with one another. There was a lot of internal strife, although they wouldn't have seen it as internal. Up until the point that the Persian Empire attacks, the Greeks, they don't think of themselves as having a unified identity in particular. But they develop a wartime system of propaganda during this very dangerous moment in their history, in which the Greeks decide that they represent one set of cultural values, the Hellenic values that we think of so wonderfully as democracy and philosophy and medicine and science and many of the other things that we celebrate still to this day, at least in high cultural contexts that we were given by the Greek cultural conflicts of that time, right? These city-states and the way they were competing with one another. And then on the other hand, the Eastern culture. The Eastern culture of the Persian Empire actually was very sophisticated with a tremendous degree of cultural education and sophisticated road networks, a tax system, monetary structure, etc. But the Greeks decided that they were going to call those Easterners a word that would designate a complete otherness. They were going to make them an other because they needed to unite the Greeks against the Persians for the purposes of war. And so they came up with this word barbarian to describe it. The word had already existed. It actually is itself a linguistic moniker. It means the nonsense that you hear. So when a Greek person hears a non-Greek speaking, it sounded to them like bar, bar, bar. Right? So for us, blah, 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 or something akin to that. So a barbarian is literally a person who doesn't speak Greek. And the idea was if you didn't speak Greek, then you didn't have Greek culture. If you didn't have Greek culture, then you were uncivilized. If you were uncivilized, then you had no right to interact or especially not invade or in some way interfere with Greek cultural life, right? So the Greco-Persian Wars did a lot to separate this East and West, and the concept of the West as being enlightened, intellectual, rational, and the East somehow was supposed to be all of the opposite things. These established a key binary that actually is still going on in our concept of culture today. The divisions between the East and the West are profound and they're important, and we remanufacture them constantly in our image of identity. And yet, as I reminded you just above, we are actually in a condition of hybridity, right? If you'd like to watch this scene from the movie 300, you'll notice in this encounter between the Spartans, the Greeks, and the messengers from the Persian Empire, that there's an idealization of the Greek life, right, in contrast to what seems to be the strangeness of the Persian emissary, the Persian messenger. So what I'd encourage you to do is watch this and then think about how things like race and gender and concepts of the East and West and all of the other binaries that we've been learning about are actually in play in the construction of this notion of the barbarian East versus the civilized West. There's a name for this construction, for this binarization in a hierarchical manner. The name is Orientalism, right? From that term Oriens that we introduced a short time ago, the concept of Orientalism, just like racism or sexism, is the notion that there is an essential difference between people from one area and people from another, and that can be designated in terms of this notion of the Western values and the Eastern values. So people in the West started to separate conceptually in terms of their identity from the people that they regarded as being from the East. Again, this is not nearly the straightforward story that we would like to have in these binary constructs, but one of the ways that we did start to separate these notions was the field of aesthetics. The field of aesthetics actually is originally derived from a straightforward Greek word, asthenomai, which means to perceive, right? So aesthetics for us today today is how we talk about art or beauty more generally in a philosophical context. It was originally introduced in the philosophical way by Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten, and his book in 18th century Germany sparked one of the most important philosophers, Immanuel Kant, also in Germany, to write seriously about aesthetics. And he made three key claims about an aesthetic object that changed forever our notion of what we're doing when we, for example, go to the Louvre Art Museum and look at a painting. He said, first of all, that when we perceive something as beautiful, we think that it's beautiful because it's universally beautiful. Right? So in other words, even if somebody doesn't like a painting that we like, we think we can still make arguments that would convince them or should convince them to like it better. Think about debates that you've had with your friends where you like a movie and they don't, or vice versa. You can make arguments because you believe somewhere in that conversation that there are universal standards that you can appeal to about beauty. Second, the idea that it is intuitive. And this is a very interesting one. When you see something, you like it. You don't even necessarily need to know why. If you ever wandered around an art museum, sometimes you see pieces that don't appeal to you at all, and then something will capture you. If that's happened to you or something similar to that, think about what intuition is going on there, right? You have an immediate experience of being drawn to something and liking it often, and then afterwards you manufacture those reasons that make it feel universal. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, is the concept that art must be disinterested. And by disinterested, Kant meant specifically that you didn't make art for any other purpose than to be enjoyed aesthetically. That's interesting too, and it's one of the guiding assumptions of the art hanging in the Louvre in the upper parts of the palace. Whereas when we look at the Fang mask, part of what makes it an artifact is the notion that it perhaps was not disinterested. Probably it was used in rituals or some sort of cultural events, or as a form of display in terms of cultural concepts of power. Whatever it was and however it was used in those contexts, for us the fact that it's not disinterested, simply hanging on a wall being beautiful and there to be admired, but had some cultural purpose, is actually a negative, if you will. It's a way of seeing this as not fully a piece of art. But when you see something like the Mona Lisa, you don't think, how many nails could I hammer with that picture? You think, here's the famous painting, right? And there's that instance of the disinterestedness of our artistic experience. If you look at the statue of the Apollo Belvedere, which we'll talk about in a couple of different contexts in this class and in your textbook, we can say that this Greek statue is supposed to embody universal, intuitive, and disinterested ideals of art that have been emulated. And in the 18th and the 19th centuries, the birth of the art museum gave people a place to house these idealized forms, right? So here we're very much in Plato land, aren't we? We're looking at things that are supposed to express this masterpiece of essential beauty and qualities that we're looking for. And yet what we're starting to see now is that those supposedly universal, intuitive, and disinterested pieces of art actually do have a purpose. They express concepts of cultural dominance, notions of superiority, theories of identity, etc. All right? So what Kant was arguing in the end, and what the philosophy of aesthetics as a whole has tended to argue, is that the experience of beauty should be intellectual, above all intellectual. So when you're walking around in an art museum, you probably notice you're not allowed to touch anything, right? And the kids are running around and playing and being too loud. We tend to think that that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to walk around and be very intellectual and contemplate the art. I'm not really sure why. It's not very fun to do that. It'd be much more interesting to live around the art and to have more boisterous conversations and a little bit more lively interaction. But because of the traditions of aesthetics that we have in Western culture, we try very hard to intellectualize those. That's because these pieces of art for us are supposed to form what Matthew Arnold called the touchstone. Ideal forms of beauty that we can use to learn from in order to become adept at identifying true beauty in other contexts. So if I read poetry and then I'm reading something else, I can know whether or not that other thing that I'm reading matches the standards of beauty of language that I've found or achieved in poetry. Similarly, I can do that with art, pictorial art, statues, and so on. There are many, many things that you can learn about specifically in this way by building a set of touchstones. So it's a pedagogical concept, right? And these touchstones form a group of things that we think of as better than everything else, right? Which is the canon. The word canon here doesn't refer to the thing that you can shoot things with. It refers specifically to a body of art or objects that we think of as making up the essential cultural elements of our ideal formation. So ideal beauty, that could be one, but also many other things. When you go through high school, you take literature classes and you read books that are considered canonical, part of the official canon. Undoubtedly, all of you were tortured by high school level Shakespeare, which is not how you should encounter Shakespeare. Shakespeare should be alive, just as I was saying, something you should interact with and have fun with. Shakespeare himself as a playwright was very irreverent, but we treat this stuff as, somehow fancy. But in fact, of course, that's because it's actually entered into this intellectualized aestheticism that was born with the Enlightenment and Kantian philosophy, and therefore has become part of the official canon. We tend to resist things in the canon because they're old and they're dead and they're boring. But in fact, they don't have to be. That's actually a product of the educational approach to these ideas rather than the actual qualities that they may contain. In other words, reading Shakespeare actually is pretty fun and you shouldn't give up on it. Okay, so how does this match up with Plato's theories of beauty? Well, very well, actually. It's fairly close. And Plato did not talk about aesthetics per se. Remember, that was born in the Enlightenment, so the 1800s, or 1700s, 1800s, much, much later than Plato, who lived 2,500 years or so before that. But we do have some writings from Plato on beauty that do definitely apply to these same discussions. Most famously, his book on the Symposium. I have a good video here that discusses the basics of the situation in the Symposium, but it's fairly easy to describe. The Symposium actually is a drinking game that the Greeks would play. So imagine sort of like an intellectual version of beer pong or something like that. What they would do is gather together and get drunk on wine, and while they were getting drunk, they would listen to music and play a game. One of their favorite games was to take the leftovers at the bottom of their wine glasses and swirl it around and try to throw them against the wall to hit a target. So very much like beer pong. But one of the other things that they would do as a form of entertainment was practice oratory, which is a competitive form of speaking. And in Plato's Symposium, he has his famous character Socrates make a speech about the form of beauty. Each person who gets up in the Symposium talks about an ideal concept of beauty, and at the end, Socrates gets up and gives a very Platonic answer to this notion. He says, the reason that we find certain things beautiful is that they remind us of an ideal essence that we already have in our mind. And that ideal essence is pure. It's not part of this world, right? So you'll recall from chapter 1 and 2 and on that we've been talking about Plato's concept of eidos in exactly those terms. If you see somebody and you think that they're beautiful and then therefore you have some sort of desire for them, Socrates argues that you actually don't understand what that beauty is. But as you get to know that person and you spend more time with them, you see more aspects and more complexity about their beauty, and so you come to appreciate them for more than just their physical beauty and the desire that you have for them. As you do that, you do something that resembles walking up the rungs of a ladder, in which you get into higher and higher forms of beauty, and you understand the more and more abstract aspect of that. Remember, for Plato, the physical world is always a bad copy of the ideals that we have in our mind, or in the world of eidos. And so this difference between the copy and the ideal is something that he thinks he sees in beauty itself. When we find somebody attractive, Plato would argue, and remember his character Socrates is the one making the argument here, that Socrates would say that when we experience somebody's beauty, what we're really doing is reminding ourselves of that abstract truth of ideal beauty that we have in our minds, and our appreciation of other people's beauty around us actually is more tied into that desire to get to that eidos, right? One of the effects of this for Plato is that beauty has moral qualities. Okay, so when we see somebody who is beautiful, we tend to think that they are a good person. They don't have to be, of course, but our attraction to them in various ways for various reasons influences our assumptions about those people and tends to move us in a positive direction in our feelings. Plato thought that was because the truth of the eidos is a moral quality all by itself, right? Ideal beauty is the highest goal and therefore is something that we should strive to achieve, just like ideal justice or ideal happiness is something that we could look for. We can see the way that beauty shapes our notions of morality and the inner qualities that a person should have in things like Disney, for example, right? Why is it that the heroines and the heroes are always so good looking and normal looking as well, whereas the monsters or the enemies or the bad guys tend to have other things going on, right? They have darker skin, or they look unattractive because they're fat, or because they have some sort of accent, and so on, right? This is not absolutely universally true in Disney, just 95% of the time, right? So you can really see the way that our concepts of platonic beauty influence things like the way that we enjoy something like a movie, right? Next time you're watching a movie, Disney or otherwise, notice the way that the looks of the characters and our attraction to those different characters actually shape some of the narrative structure of how we believe the people are either good or bad. How we apply moral qualities, in other words, to beauty. Okay, so let's talk about the way these theories of beauty that we've inherited from Plato through to Kant, the notion that beauty is universal and disinterested, that we can argue about it, we intuit that it's beauty, but that it's fundamentally not for any purpose, and that those things that we experience as ideal beauty can actually shape a better moral position on the world, and therefore we should be educated into that canon, right? So, as I mentioned before, this was a theory introduced by Matthew Arnold in his notion of the touchstone. In his idea of the touchstone, he's talking specifically here about poetry, but what he really means is art in general. He says, indeed, there can be no more useful help for discovering what poetry belongs to the class of the truly excellent, and can therefore do us most good, than to have always in one's mind lines and expressions of the great masters, and to apply them as a touchstone to other poetry. Here you can really hear the Platonism, right? That you learn from the masters who are the closest to the ideal forms, and you compare everything else. Here, in this context of the canon, difference is negative, isn't it, right? Things that fall away from those ideals are not simply different, but they are different in a hierarchical structure in which they become inferior, right? So the Mona Lisa is a great painting, and by contrast, we can look at other portraits, other styles, other ideas of painting and say they're not as good. We can do that in terms of monetary value or cultural prestige, but we can also look at it strictly from a cultural position. For example, in the early 20th century, the group of artists known as the modernists established a contrast to the ideas of the canon that they felt were actually smothering artistic creativity and ability, and so they took as their slogan what Ezra Pound named "Make it new," right? The idea that the purpose of modernism, which comes from the Latin word modus, or now, is to make art present, vital, something that we can get a hold of. Ironically, by the way, the modernist artists ended up becoming very famous in the 20th century, and now they themselves have also been integrated into the canon. So it wasn't simply enough to break away, and yet it was a really important shift. Take, for example, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, one of the most famous paintings by the great Pablo Picasso. Picasso was born in Barcelona in Spain, but he moved to Paris right around the Louvre, and he went to the Louvre all the time to study the art there. But what he ended up doing is, instead of focusing on paintings like the Oath of the Horatii, where we had a canonical representation of idealized art, Instead, he started hanging out in those basement areas, those spaces where the artifacts were. And what he ended up doing was noticing that there was beauty and something interestingly complex, as well as different in a way that Picasso himself valued in these representations. So if you look at the two figures on the right here, notice that these women actually have faces depicted in terms of African masks. That's because Picasso was interested in a form of stylistic representation called cubism, in which representational distortion becomes a form of meaning. Right? So the painting itself is already provocative. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is a reference to the idea that these 5 women posing are prostitutes, and of course they are posing in provocative ways. And then on top of that, he's using artifacts in order to create this piece of art. So he's really provoking a lot of the canonical assumptions about morality and normative Western culture. These ideas were then taken and extended in a number of different directions by other modernists. Take, for example, this Italian painting from the Futurists, one of the most important groups of modernists. Look at the wild perspective. If you look at it long enough, you may understand that this is somebody painting from a balcony at night. So the street lights are on, people are down in the cafes doing things, but the distortion of the perspective is disorienting, isn't it? Right. So there's that word again, disorientation. The modernists, whether it was through the use of artifacts in terms of art or in terms of changing our perspective on the world, were trying to disorient us precisely because they disagreed with the canonical structure of hierarchical meaning. This is actually quite a beautiful painting, right? So if we think about it here, what we have is a dynamic, disruptive, and unprecedented or new form of art. And that was summarized eventually by the Russian formalist critic Viktor Shklovsky, with the term ostranenie, or defamiliarization. And defamiliarization simply means taking things that we think we know and representing them in such a way that we have to look at them again, right? And so defamiliarization in many ways, just like the phrase "make it new," became the kind of watchword of the modernist artists. This was contrasted to certain notions of popular culture that were emergent at the same time. And again, I mentioned this. The modernists began this process of artistic creativity in order to overthrow the canon. But ironically, what they ended up doing is creating simply another binary. The opposite binary to high modernist art was what we call kitsch. Kitsch was named by an important art historian in the United States, who was actually the head curator for the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, the most important museum of art in the United States. And what he has to say about kitsch is that this popular form of art is actually something that we should denigrate, that we should dislike, and we should get rid of as much as we can in our culture. Here's how he describes it. He says, kitsch is mechanical and operates by formulas. Kitsch is vicarious experience and faked sensations. Kitsch changes according to the style, but remains always the same. Kitsch is the epitome, or the essence, he means here, of all that is spurious or fake in the life of our times. Kitsch pretends to demand nothing of its customers except their money, not even their time. Now, you can, again, hear the academic mode of talking, the high cultural approach to discussing ideas here. But it's actually fairly easy to understand kitsch. If you look at the images that I've included up here at the top, Michael Jackson with bubbles, the unicorn with the flowers, a strange image of Abraham Lincoln with sunglasses, and so on, what we see actually is that this kind of garbage that we can buy every day is low culture, isn't it? Right? So we think of it as kitsch precisely because the word kitsch means garbage, right? The stuff that we can just buy at a Walmart or a one of those small shops outside of or in a large city, right, where that has all kinds of little plastic trinkets or whatnot. In those spaces, they are absolutely filled with all of this stuff. So if I call it garbage in this case, I put quotation marks around it. But culturally, we do actually tend to think of this stuff as inconsequential. It's in bad taste. And that notion of taste, again, depends on our cultural assumptions, the canon that we've inherited that gives us the certain right standards of taste by which we can start to contrast these objects. So the great art of the canon make up our cultural touchstones, and kitsch is that stuff around us that seems to be multiplying with mass popular culture, right? Think about how much of this stuff you can actually buy. Let's say you walk into Walmart, and every time you see one of these kitschy items, you purchase it. How many of them do you think you would actually find before you got out of there, right? Hundreds? Maybe even thousands, right? And they're all being manufactured mostly with cheap materials, plastic, etc. They mostly don't cost very much. And many of our homes are actually filled with these objects. And many of us like them, and they bring us happiness. And that is all really valid and important. And yet it's important to recognize also that the concept of having cultural standards, the notion of a canon and a touchstone, the kinds of things that you encounter in, say, an educational institution, really has no way of coping with this concept of kitsch, right? It has to reject it and create a binary of hierarchical meaning, because kitsch actually threatens to invade and change those values in ways that are disturbing. So let's talk about defamiliarization as we start to wrap up this discussion. For now, we're going to continue on with the concepts of culture in the next couple of chapters as we unpack more of the details around it. But for now, I want to remind you of the modernist desire for defamiliarization and the ways that that modernist project to upset the canon and to disrupt it actually ended up failing. Okay, so defamiliarization is really a remarkably well spelled out theory on the part of Shklovsky. He describes it in the following way. He says, the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the length and difficulty of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object itself is not important. I love that line, to increase the length and difficulty of perception. So when we look at art, sometimes we think, what is this, right? It's confusing. And yet if we spend enough time with it and we learn enough learn enough of the cultural touchstones that are reference points to these pieces of art, sometimes we can unlock or unpack some of that. But we have to do it through an increased length and difficulty of perception, don't we, right? Art doesn't simply give meaning. And this, by the way, is importantly different from Plato's idea, right? Remember, for Plato, that essence is given, is the thing that you have in your mind from the very moment of birth that tells you what the world is in its true forms. You simply have to go through the process of anagnoresis, remembering it, putting it back together. Here, defamiliarization is exactly the opposite concept. It's the notion that we should make things challenging so that we have to think about them, because the process of thinking about them, here's that intellectualism, right, that we inherit from Kant, the process of thinking about the object already is the purpose of it. This is an idea that one of the most important art critics in the art and cultural critics of the 20th century took on and really made his own. Theodor Adorno was Jewish German, born in the period in which he saw the rise of Nazi Germany, and so he had to flee Germany like so many Jews. He was a brilliant theoretician and logician, so he had no problem finding a job. Eventually he landed in the United States and moved, of all places, to Los Angeles, which he found very disturbing because of his own cultural viewpoints or set of beliefs. He was a modernist in the sense that he really supported defamiliarization. And what he saw in Los Angeles is a world of what he would call kitsch, by contrast, right? Easy, cheap, plastic, new. These attributes are things that he wrote about and thought about quite a bit. He felt that modern capitalist culture, the world that we live in now of mass production that allows us to have so many kitschy objects, that these things actually were deadening us because they were taking us away from the real things that we should be valuing, like community, friendship, relationships among each other, like our neighbors and things like that. And the more that we were moving away from that world into a consumerist world, the more we were being isolated in ways that allowed us to continue to buy, but actually were not good for either our souls or the society that we lived in. So you can see Theodor Adorno actually has a strong moral position on capitalism and the world that we live in now. And instead, by contrast, he believed that we should surround ourselves with things that he could characterize as defamiliarizing. In the set of lectures here, I actually have a piece of music that Theodor Adorno composed. He was a classical composer of a very high rank, actually, before he became a professional philosopher. And amongst professional musicians, very often Theodor Adorno is actually well known. Here I have a piece that's the red image on the far right that I suggest that you play, but only for a little while. I like to, it doesn't actually, this piano piece doesn't have a title, but I like to call this Murder in an Elevator, because I imagine that if you were actually stuck in an elevator listening to this, you'd go crazy. Right? So why is this piece so unpleasant to listen to? Maybe you find it intellectually interesting, right? And that for Adorno, I think, would be good. But when you think about this in contrast to music that you enjoy listening to, which would be part of the pop culture, the kitsch that he dislikes so much, we can really start to ask some interesting questions, right? Why is it that defamiliarization is so unpleasant to us? Why is that experience of disorientation one that we tend not to like very much at all? And why is this intellectual work the thing that we're supposed to be looking for? What is the matter fundamentally with enjoying things in an easier way? Watching the movies that simply present us with a world that's already familiar to us, or listening to music that doesn't challenge our ears, at least not very much. These questions are left unresolved by Theodor Adorno because I think in some ways they're irresolvable. There is no way to decide, right? On the one hand, what we do in the academy, in higher education, is to challenge, right? We challenge students, we challenge you when you take university courses. These are not meant to be easy. So in fact, defamiliarization is in some ways built into the very structure of our education system. At the same time, we insist on reference points or touchstones that you have to learn about. We don't meet you halfway. You don't get to bring in your cultural interests and your cultural concepts, and then we work with those. Instead, we're presenting the information and we're presenting the interpretation of that information. And that causes certain problems, doesn't it? Right? On the one hand, Adorno is right that sophisticated music is more sophisticated. It's more interesting for the intellectual, perhaps. And yet, if none of us are intellectually sophisticated to understand something like this piano piece that he's composed, what's the point? What is the point, right? So here we are. We have to leave this chapter off at this point, but there is no resolution, at least from where we are at this point. I do want to remind you, however, that we're going to come back to this in later chapters. And the key to really understanding how we're going to solve this problem that Adorno brings up between defamiliarization and kitsch is the theory of hybridity that I introduced earlier. I'll see you next time.